You can all hear me? Yes. Perfect. Yeah. Hello, hello. And thank you so much for having me here. It's really beautiful on that stage. I think it's the most beautiful stage that I've stood on. So yeah, thanks for choosing my talk. And I'm really happy to share some insights and best practices today on building internal developer platforms to enhance developer experience. I'm Christina. I'm one of the co-founders of MeshCloud and CRO. MeshCloud is a Frankfurt-based company. We are a platform engineering company, and we do build internal developer platforms for large organizations like Volkswagen, Commerzbank, Metro, many more. So complex organizations use our product to build their internal platforms, and we've been doing that for quite some time. So we started even before platform engineering was like one of the big buzzwords that we have to talk about. And one of the things that I really like is the platform as a product approach that has been growing in the past years and months in particular, because I believe that there's a lot in common when it comes to building platforms, internal platforms, but also building products. And as a product company, there's a lot that you can apply from how you grow a startup, how you build a team, and how you launch a product to the market, to how to actually build an internal platform within an organization. Now, why this talk? Well, platform engineering is everywhere, right? And it seems to be a very sexy thing to do. So a lot of DevOps engineers or DevOps teams are kind of transforming into platform teams. So I would like to know who of you has like platform in their title here. Don't be too shy. Okay, that's not too many. That's good. There was a recent survey by Enterprise Strategy Group, which asked 500 organizations with more than 500 people if they do platform engineering, and a bit more than half said they are already on board. And one of the topics that all of these organizations are really concerned about is how to actually expand the adoption. So people have started building these internal platforms, and what they need to take care of now is basically, how do I get more people to use that platform? Because if I build something that is not used by a lot of people, the value is quite limited and you will run into issues. We will also touch those issues in a bit. So what I'm planning to do in this talk is to talk about 3 stories and pitfalls that a lot of platform teams run into when building internal platforms. And yeah, the first story is about cognitive load. So a lot of platform teams that we work with, they do build their platforms in order to reduce cognitive load for their developers, right? And why does that topic come up so often lately? And why is it increasing so much that nobody can handle it anymore? Well, I think there are 3 main reasons for that. And the first one is that security requirements are increasing. I mean, maybe the requirements are not increasing, but the responsibility of the developers for security requirements is increasing. So to give you an example, I was working with a company a couple of weeks back, and they launch a lot of new products. And for every new product that they launch, they have to comply with the ISO 27001 standard. So basically, their management dropped these controls that you have to implement for the ISMS to the developers and said, well, please take care of complying with these controls and think about how you can do that for every new product that is launched. For the developers, that was quite a shock or a pain in the ass, so to say, because they knew it's critical. They know that these auditors come in, but they have to think about how can we actually do that and how can we still keep building our product while making sure that we didn't forget any of the security and compliance requirements we have to fulfill. The second part, cloud meaning more ops. That was an original quote of one of the application teams that we worked with. And they said, well, since we do cloud, actually, we have to do a lot more operations tasks that we didn't have to do before. So while things were pretty slow before, we were not responsible, for example, for running and operating our Kubernetes clusters. Now we do get an Azure subscription and we have to take care of our Kubernetes clusters ourselves. And that's something that they have to learn or that they have to find people that actually do have that skill. So that's another aspect that brings more cognitive load to those teams. And the third one, cloud is mainstream. Well, I think that's quite obvious, but what do I mean by that? Well, in the beginning, when cloud was new, there were mostly the people using the cloud that actually knew how the cloud works and knew what they were doing in there. But by now that cloud is mainstream, you have a lot of less mature teams that are leveraging cloud technologies. And in order to serve these less mature teams, or in order for them to use the cloud right, they have to learn a lot of new skills. They have to learn about cloud native development, and they have to learn about the other things that I mentioned earlier. So it becomes much harder to convince them. Oftentimes, they also do not really want to learn new stuff. So you have to, as a platform team and as somebody that is serving these developers, cloud native developers, you have to think about how can you make your product good enough for them to use and to really achieve the goal of reducing that cognitive load. So I brought a couple of answers, or at least a couple of ideas on how we can, well, address these increasing cognitive load aspects within our platforms. And the first one is that while a lot of people that build internal platforms and are planning to build in some fancy AI features, for example, and offer AI services via their platform, one of the quick wins that they can get is if they offer services with built-in security. If they offer services that make it easy to do things right and that make it easier for the teams to also comply, for example, with the standards and the controls that have been dropped to them. Second part is obviously it does not always make sense to give people the whole freedom. So to give people their AWS account, their Azure subscription, and then tell them, okay, and for all the other tasks, it's your responsibility now. So taking care of operational tasks like running these managed Kubernetes clusters or providing managed namespaces or managed databases can be a help to these development teams and can reduce their cognitive load. And at last, you should always know who your users and your internal customers are, right? So you should interview them, you should understand where do they stand, how mature are they, what's their skill level, and what do I as a platform team need to build in order to serve them and in order to achieve a reduction of cognitive load. And the important thing is you should not only do that in the beginning when you start building your platform, but on a continuous basis, because the users in the beginning might be different users than the ones that you have later on. And then there's one more thing, and that's really the aspect of integration, because not everything is a platform. A lot of things are called a platform by now, and oftentimes also things are called a platform that are more of a wiki, which tells you how to do certain things. And oftentimes you need a lot of prerequisites before you can actually start building your application. So you might need to go through a security approval, you might need to go through an onboarding flow where you actually get the environments that you work in. You might have to register your application or your product with asset management. You might have to get a budget approval. And that means that you have to interact with a lot of silos within the organization before you can actually get started. And you might lose a lot of time and you have to invest a lot of thoughts into how do you do this and make sure that everything is in place before you can start working. On the other hand, so that's why the arrows go out of the wiki, right? It's documented there, so it's already better than not documenting it, but it's still, the cognitive load is not really reduced. On the other side, if you do have a platform that already integrates these different aspects and that creates, for example, an onboarding flow which asks all the relevant questions and then sends the relevant data to the different systems within the organization, you can really achieve a reduction in cognitive load. And to give you an idea on how this reduction could look like, I've put together a couple of metrics that we also like to look at, like the time to cloud, Without an IDP, it can take days. With the IDP, it can take a couple of minutes. The time to compliance, I mean, of course, you cannot fully automate that, but you can also bring it down from weeks to days by bringing stuff together that belongs together, by pre-filling, and by automating a lot of the requirements that are in place. And you can look at policy automation coverage. So if you manage to cover a lot of the controls with policies within the cloud and they come like that out of the box, that's where we've seen coverage of up to 80% of the requirements. And then at some point you should also see the security incidents, if you have some security scanning tool, go down because you have like preventive security built into your platform if you do it right. So as a result, what you manage to do is you will have developers work less on non-functional requirements and more on customer-facing features, which is basically what you want. Next one, and this is about shared responsibility. So in Lena's talk, we already saw the different shared responsibility models for the different kind of cloud patterns. So is it infrastructure as a service or serverless? When I talk about shared responsibility here, it's more about the shared responsibility within an organization. So I think it's quite clear what the cloud provider is doing and what the customer is doing, but within the customer organization, so within your organizations, you still have to align what is the platform team doing and what are the developers doing, and this should be clear. The model that you see in the background is the Cloud Foundation Maturity Model. That's a model that we've developed together with our customers. You can find it on cloudfoundation.org. There are a lot of other capabilities in there. But the one capability that kind of brings up a lot of discussions is this alignment on shared responsibility. So basically both parties, the platform team and the developers, should be aware of what their responsibility is and should be clear about what that responsibility is. And I've put up an example on the, it's the right side from your perspective, which talks about on-premise connectivity, right? So you get a cloud environment with on-premise connectivity, and in that case, it's the Cloud Foundation. So that would be the platform team that takes care of the network controls and of the connectivity, but the application team has the responsibility of all the other aspects within that cloud environment. And basically writing that down can help to clarify a lot of things, because if you don't, this is what can happen. There are two cases here. So if we think about an organization where developers have a lot of autonomy and a lot of freedom, and then you suddenly start implementing an internal developer platform to kind of consolidate things because you realize as the management that there are a lot of people working on the same things and you want to become more efficient and centralize some of these aspects. This can be challenging because developers might feel restricted by the responsibility cut that they're experiencing, and they might kind of resist adopting this internal developer platform. In the second case, you might actually have developers that are not used to carry a lot of responsibility. So they rely on other teams, on infrastructure teams, on operations teams to get their infrastructure and deployments and operations of the application handled. And then suddenly you say, well, as there are more and more applications that we need to take care of, actually these teams, they cannot keep up. So we will introduce an IDP in order to resolve these operational bottlenecks and address the increased demand. The problem is that the developers are actually not ready for that, right? They feel overwhelmed because suddenly they get a lot of freedom, they get a lot of choices, and they don't know what the right choices are. So while they might have self-service with a platform, they actually do not use it because they don't know how. Both of these cases are not great. Because, well, if you have little usage of your platform actually brings little value to the organization, right? If your goal is to enhance developer experience or to reduce cognitive load or to increase or reduce time to market for new applications, like you will not reach this goal if there's not a lot of people actually using that platform. And if the value is little, the impact is also little. And if that impact is little, you will not get more money for it. So while people will kind of fund that in the beginning and say, okay, you have a budget to set that up, you might get budget cuts after a year, after 2 years, if the expected impact is not happening. And then if you don't have a budget, you can also not really make it better, which also, if there's not a lot of people using it, you will not get a lot of feedback, which will also prevent you from making it better. So it's kind of a downwards spiral that you don't want to end up in. The opposite, I don't have it on the picture, but we can all imagine, right? There's a lot of usage, then there's a lot of value. You see the impact, you get more money for it, you have more money to bring in more people that can actually build better services or more services, or you can kind of integrate other teams into providing services for your platform. When a lot of people use it, you get a lot of feedback and you can iterate and improve on the services, and it's really a success. So this is actually what you want to have. Now, how can we address this unclarity and shared responsibility and also kind of close these adoption gaps? Well, the first step is to write it down, right? And while this will not really change everything, obviously, because it's just another page in your documentation, it might shorten the discussions that you have on that topic in the future, and that's already quite helpful. So whenever there's unclarity, you will look at it and you will say, guys, we already discussed about it. Here's what we've decided. We can either change that or we should just remember and live with that decision. It also forces you to take a decision in the first place, which is oftentimes the step that is missing for a lot of teams here. When you do that, it makes sense to do it on a per use case type. So we had, for example, yesterday at the speaker dinner, the discussion on whether you should basically provide namespaces to your teams or full Kubernetes clusters, right? And depending on what type of service you decide upon, there will be a different split in responsibilities between the platform team and the application teams. So you can have different types of services depending on the use cases, and for each of these use case types, so let's say lift and shift, container, cluster as a service, you can basically then have this responsibility matrix. Then another thing that's always very helpful is to involve developers in platform development, because if they're part of the development, the acceptance will be much higher, and you as a platform team will better understand their perspective, their needs, and like you're kind of sitting in the same boat. You both want to make it work, and you can kind of prevent that rejection from the application side. So that's especially very helpful if you have development teams that do have a lot of responsibility at the moment, that do have a lot of autonomy, and you want them to adopt the platform. If they kind of are part of the invention of the platform and of the development, the adoption is usually much better. The next point is you should invest in user experience, and probably you should invest more than you might think you have to. And this is especially the case for the less mature users, because if they don't know how to use your platform and then they don't know what to do in the cloud, the hurdle to get into the cloud is even higher. So really focus on providing the right ways to access and to interact with your platform. This can be a user interface, this can be an API. In a lot of cases, it does make sense to have both of these angles basically as an access point to your platform, because you will have different types of users that you need to address. And then sharing platform MVPs early. That's just what the experience shows, right? If you can show something and not just tell why it's useful, it helps. And also, if you then have different iterations, they will see it again and again and again. They can give feedback, they will be heard, and they will, hopefully like to use the platform better than without this. Number 3, the maturity gap you might not be aware of. So what we see here is kind of a common journey that, organizations go through, from manual provisioning to having infrastructure as code, but probably on some like local storage. In the worst case that I've seen, it was basically an internal platform team that hired a consultancy. The consultancy had the infrastructure as code modules, and then whenever something was requested, they had to call the consultancy, they had to adapt the modules, and then they had to implement. And that, of course, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's very expensive, and it does take a lot of time, right? So the more advanced teams, if they do have the skill, they go into like more GitOps-like approaches. So there's a central repository and there's a clear kind of interaction mode based on pull requests on how platform teams and application teams interact. Or sometimes you might have the application team actually create a ticket and then the platform team takes care of the GitOps part. Now, what is the issue with that? The issue with that is that you basically still have quite a high cognitive load for the application teams. While in the first two cases, the application team doesn't really need to know anything about how it works because it is done for them, the friction for them is quite high because they have to wait on somebody else to do it for them. In the last case, well, it might be faster because they can just create the pull request themselves, but they have to have a quite high level of skill in order to understand what is being provided to them, what options they have in terms of configuration and so on. And in all cases, the platform team actually might become a bottleneck because they're always in the loop. They're always involved in the process. So what can we do to solve that? Well, developer portals with like a service marketplace are one of the solutions to that, that you have a fully automated provisioning process, right? But while that sounds very easy, there are little challenges in the adoption of self-service as well. And oftentimes you think, yeah, it's a great idea, but for us, this won't work. So why doesn't it work for a lot of organizations, or why do they think it doesn't work for them? Well, first of all, the services have not been built with the customer in focus, right? They have been built for a platform team that is thinking about themselves and maybe their colleagues who are going to use the pipelines or who are going to use the setup, and they can handle that. They know how it works. They know they might not need documentation and so on, but the service itself doesn't have a maturity that is high enough for an end user like an application team to use it. And that can be difficult, and then they don't want to basically open up that service and really provide it throughout the whole organization. The second part is missing platform capability. So if you just have the automation, but you don't think about where do I actually track who's using what in terms of like services, cloud environments, and so on. How do I even check if people have the budgets to do that? It can become a bit of a Wild West. And for a lot of organizations, this is not an option. They need a bit more governance. So they need some basic platform capabilities that are not really related to the automation of the services that should be provided, but that are kind of, the user interface, the cost management, the security, the compliance, like these governance aspects that they have to take care of and that oftentimes fall down. So you have to think about how can you cover these things for your platform. And then there's a risk of basically fragmentation. If you only provide, for example, a repository with templates and you leave all the options open to the application teams, that can be quite painful because while they have a good starting point, day two operations will be kind of a hell because you don't really know how they've changed the templates and how to deal with this change. And in the end, they might still come back to you and ask you to fix it, but you don't really know what it is anymore because it's completely open. So, how can we address these challenges, right? Build your services with your customer in mind, which means that you should require as little context as possible from them. They should only have the options that are relevant to them when it comes to configuration, and you should probably have some supporting services like support, documentation, like some kind of Slack or Teams channel where they can ask questions, and you should test the service with a couple of pilot users to see if they understand how it works or not. For the missing platform capabilities, well, you should think about some basics that you need there, right? A tenant database, the cost transparency, the provisioning process that fits your specific users. There are tools around that kind of solve these things, so that's an option, or you have to consider it when building the platform yourself. And then for the template sprawl, basically you can offer golden paths, so you can limit the amount of options people have when it comes to configuration, and you should think about how you actually manage upgrades, new versions of services. So don't only think about the first day when somebody provisions something, but also how this is going to be maintained in the long run. And with that, a quick recap. So reduction of cognitive load is one of the key value drivers for internal developer platforms. And in order to make sure that you actually achieve that, it's really helpful to integrate different silos that application teams would have to interact with otherwise. Then if you do have shifts in responsibilities that you want to kind of roll out with your platform, it helps to have a user interface which reflects them. So not to only write down, this is how it will work from now on, but to actually include that into the workflow and into the process so people are more aware of what they need to do now. And then if you design your services, you should have your internal customers in mind to reach the self-service maturity faster. And with that, I already get a red alarm here. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to get your questions.